This presentation outlines the value of Indigenous knowledge to communities and their place in transdisciplinary research. A case study of the Kaikoura earthquake context is used to illustrate this. The research has been developed by Māori researchers from Massey University in partnership with Ngāi Tahu, the local Māori tribe. A community-led participatory approach was applied to conducting qualitative research informed by a Māori worldview in order to explore Māori earthquake stories. We aim to document the enablers, tensions and outcomes associated with applying Indigenous knowledges to manage the impacts of the Kaikoura earthquake on communities. We found Ngāi Tahu employed an effective response that was driven by cultural values, knowledges and practices. And they partnered with government ministries, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and NGOs within the first 24 hours to deploy their response. Media promotion of the effectiveness of the response has facilitated widespread public recognition, and Ngāi Tahu has subsequently been appointed to the Kaikoura Recovery Group. In terms of impacts and the value of Indigenous knowledges for communities and more widely, we found Indigenous knowledges were usefully applied to reduce disaster impacts on Māori, regional visitors including tourists, and the wider community. Māori cultural knowledges and values have promoted collective identity, authority, agency, accountability and action in the disaster context. Māori communitarian and culture-based disaster recovery responses have proven to be valuable locally, but also have national relevance in other disaster contexts. So the broader impacts have encompassed increased Māori collaborations with government, reshaping local governance and enhancing recovery in Kaikoura. During the disaster recovery phase, we found opportunities to address factors which underpin vulnerability in Māori communities appeared. Māori values and practices that promote regional resilience and sustainability are also being taken up by private and corporate stakeholders in business settings. And so Māori Indigenous knowledge is pertinent to disaster risk reduction, and this is being recognised in New Zealand legislation and policies as well as more broadly. So Indigenous knowledges are relevant to transdisciplinary research. They encompass in-depth, locale-specific data collected and evaluated over long time scales. Diverse forms of knowledge that can be used for triangulation purposes during research, explanations for changes to environments and ecosystems, and quite often in spaces where Western science doesn't have that longer record of change. However, there are tensions. Indigenous knowledges are often dismissed or marginalised in science contexts as non-evidence-based. Equally, Indigenous knowledges are positioned in some forums as the exotic other, and this has led to increased interest from non-Indigenous researchers who wish to access Indigenous knowledge. Ethic researchers lack the insider's repertoire in relation to Indigenous knowledge, and this has facilitated misunderstandings and misapplication of Indigenous knowledges in Western research contexts. The absence of an insider's perspective has equally undermined the integration of Indigenous knowledge into global science policy and legislation, and perpetuating Indigenous knowledge science gaps and thus preventing best practice research. The key to successful research involving Indigenous knowledge is understanding what Indigenous knowledges are. They're not systems, they're bodies of specialised knowledge which may be locally and globally situated. Indigenous communities are experts in their own contexts. They should determine research priorities, particularly what, how, when and where Indigenous knowledges may be relevant to research or shared. Indigenous communities should equally retain intellectual property rights for their bodies of knowledge, including new knowledges emerging from research. Research that incorporates Indigenous knowledge must be conducted in accordance with Indigenous ethical requirements and principles. And ideally, only Indigenous researchers should work with Indigenous bodies of knowledge in order to avoid knowledge misunderstandings and misapplication, ensure effective bridging of Indigenous knowledges and transdisciplinary research in science, and prevent colonisation of the discursive research and science spaces of Indigenous peoples that pertain to Indigenous knowledge. Thank you very much.